3 women were murdered inside a locked house in a gated subdivision in the middle of Paraná on the night of June 29, 1991. Not one of them was a public figure. Not one of them had enemies whose names anyone had written down. Estrellita Vizconde was 47 years old. Her daughter Carmela was 19. A year away from the future, she had been planning in the specific, practical way that 19-year-olds plan futures when they believe they have time. Her daughter Jennifer was 7. 7 years old. A child who had not yet been in the world long enough to understand that the world required caution. They were found by a neighbor whose instinct that something was wrong had been building for days until it finally became a phone call. The crime that police documented inside that house was of a violence so specific and so deliberate that it immediately ruled out accident, ruled out opportunism, and established beyond any investigative doubt that whoever entered that house that night came with intent. Within weeks, the nation had suspects. Within years, it had a verdict. Within 2 decades, it had an acquittal. And today, more than 30 years after that phone call was made, nobody has been convicted of killing Estrellita, Carmela, and Jennifer Vizconde. Nobody. That is the fact this story cannot get past. That is the fact this story begins and ends with. The Vizconde Massacre is not simply the most infamous unsolved case in Philippine criminal history, though it is that. It is not simply the longest-running, most publicly contested, most institutionally consequential legal proceeding in the post-Marcos era of the Philippine justice system, though it is that as well. The Vizconde Massacre is the case that a generation of Filipinos grew up watching and could not look away from because it asked, in the most direct and most uncomfortable way available to a criminal proceeding, the question that Filipino society has been asking about itself for as long as there has been a Philippine justice system to ask it about. Does the law work the same way for everyone? Does it apply with the same weight and the same rigor and the same patience to the families of senators as it does to the ordinary families who live in gated subdivisions and believe that the gate means something about their safety? The Vizconde case ran for 2 decades through every level of the Philippine court system and produced, at various points, a conviction and an acquittal and a national argument that has never fully resolved because the underlying question it was really about, the question of equal justice, has never been answered in a way that satisfies the people who need it answered most. The central mystery of the Vizconde Massacre is not complicated to state, even though everything surrounding it became extraordinarily complicated over the course of 30 years. A family was murdered inside a secure home in a controlled residential environment. The crime required physical access to a locked house in a gated subdivision, which meant that whoever committed it either had that access legitimately, obtained it through means that left no immediately obvious trace, or was allowed in by someone inside. The investigation that followed the discovery of the bodies had all of these physical constraints working in its favor: a limited geography, a defined population of people who could plausibly have been there, a crime scene that should, in principle, have generated recoverable evidence about who was present. And yet the investigation failed. It failed first in the immediate aftermath, when the early handling of the crime scene did not meet the standard the evidence required. It failed in its assessment of early suspects, cycling through theories that accumulated inconsistencies faster than they produced leads. And it failed, most consequentially, in its eventual reliance on a single witness whose account became the entire load-bearing structure of a prosecution that would take 15 years to build and then, in the space of a Supreme Court ruling, come down completely. The mystery is not who was suspected. The mystery is why, after 30 years of the most public and most expensive legal process in modern Philippine history, the answer to who actually committed this crime remains genuinely, officially, maddeningly unknown. Lauro Vizconde was away from the house on the night of June 29th into the early morning hours of June 30th. That absence is the first fact about him that the case record establishes, and it is worth naming the specific cruelty of what that fact meant for him, that the ordinary, unremarkable logistics of an adult evening away from home was the only thing that separated him from the fate of his wife and daughters. He came home to police tape and a story that no preparation in any life ever makes anyone ready to receive. What he did after that, the decades of public advocacy, the press conferences, the Senate hearings, the appearances at every platform that would have him, the transformation of his private grief into an institutional pressure campaign, has been described by some as the behavior of a man consumed by justice, and by others as the behavior of a man consumed by grief to the point where justice and personal pain became impossible to separate. Both descriptions are probably true simultaneously, and neither changes the essential fact of his situation, which is that he spent 30 years demanding accountability for the murder of his family and died without ever receiving an answer that a court of law was willing to put its name on and call final. There is no comfortable way to hold that reality. It simply sits there, exactly as heavy as it looks. The investigation moved through its early phases with the particular dysfunction of a process operating under pressure it was not designed to handle. Leads were pursued and abandoned. Theories were proposed and collapsed. Witnesses were interviewed who produced accounts that contradicted each other in ways that the investigators could not reconcile into a coherent narrative. And then Jessica Alfaro came forward. A self-described former associate of the accused, Alfaro produced a sworn affidavit claiming she had been present on the night of the murders and had personally witnessed events that placed Hubert Webb, the son of Senator Freddie Webb, a prominent political figure, and a group of companions inside the Vizconde house during the relevant time frame. The affidavit was detailed in the way that detailed testimony is either genuinely credible or genuinely constructed, specific about times, movements, sequences of events, and the roles of named individuals in a manner that gave the prosecution a structure for its case that the physical evidence alone had not been able to provide. The arrival of Alfaro's testimony transformed the investigation from a stalled proceeding into a charged, high-profile prosecution. It also, from the moment it arrived, attracted the kind of scrutiny that detailed, specific, politically charged testimony always attracts, because the more specific the account, the more specific the contradictions become when the defense begins testing it against independently verifiable facts. In January 2000, after a trial that had consumed the better part of a decade and the attention of the entire nation, the regional trial court convicted Hubert Webb and 6 co-accused of rape with homicide. The verdict produced 2 entirely different reactions in 2 entirely different Filipinos that were watching the same proceedings from incompatible positions. For the people who believed the prosecution's case, who trusted Alfaro's testimony, who read the conviction as proof that the system could reach even the politically connected, it was the moment that confirmed something they needed confirmed about the country they lived in. For the people who believed the defense, who found the contradictions in Alfaro's account disqualifying, who pointed to Webb's documented presence in the United States at the time of the murders as the kind of alibi that should have ended the case before it reached a verdict. It was the moment that confirmed something they had long suspected about the willingness of Philippine institutions to sacrifice individuals to the appetite of public opinion. Both reactions were genuine. Both reactions were held by serious people. And both reactions, it turned out, were going to be tested again, because the case was not finished, and the Supreme Court of the Philippines was not going to let the verdict of the regional trial court be the last word. In December 2010, the Supreme Court of the Philippines acquitted Hubert Webb and his co-accused by a vote of 10-4. The majority opinion was specific in its findings. Justice Antonio Carpio, writing for the court, concluded that Alfaro's testimony, the testimony on which the entire conviction rested, could not be considered credible beyond reasonable doubt. The court found specific, documented inconsistencies between Alfaro's account and independently verifiable facts, including evidence of Webb's physical presence in the United States during the period her testimony claimed he was in the Philippines. The alibi that the prosecution had spent years arguing was fabricated was, the Supreme Court found, supported by documentary evidence sufficient to raise the reasonable doubt that a guilty verdict requires the prosecution to eliminate. 15 years of imprisonment for the accused. 15 years of a conviction that the Supreme Court ultimately found should never have been entered. And simultaneously, 3 women whose murders had been the subject of the longest, most expensive, most publicly contested criminal proceeding in modern Philippine history, with no one convicted of committing them. The acquittal did not declare the accused innocent in the absolute sense. It declared that the evidence presented was not sufficient to sustain the conviction. Those are legally different statements. But for Lauro Vizconde, for the country watching, and for the 3 women whose names the case carried, the practical outcome was the same. No justice. No answer. No one accountable. What the Vizconde case exposed about the relationship between public opinion and the Philippine justice system is perhaps its most lasting and most uncomfortable legacy. The trial did not occur in a closed room where evidence was evaluated by neutral parties operating in calm isolation from the noise of the culture surrounding them. It occurred in real time, in full public view, in a media environment that was simultaneously newly free after the Marcos years and completely unprepared for what that freedom meant in the context of a high-profile prosecution involving the son of a sitting senator. The public had opinions before the evidence was fully assembled. The press had narratives before the testimony was fully tested. The social pressure on the institutions involved, the prosecutors, the judges, eventually the Supreme Court justices, to produce a specific outcome, or to resist producing that outcome, was visible and sustained and impossible to pretend was not a factor in the way the case moved through the system. Whether that pressure changed any specific decision made by any specific judicial officer is something that cannot be proven or disproven from the outside of any institution. What can be said is that the appearance of institutional independence, the public sense that the scales were being held level regardless of who was standing on each side, was, throughout the case, deeply contested. That contestation did not end with the acquittal. It simply changed the direction of the argument. Here is what the record of the Vizconde Massacre actually contains after 30 years. It contains the documented deaths of 3 women in a home that was supposed to be safe. It contains an investigation that failed in its earliest and most critical phases to secure the crime scene and the evidence to the standard required. It contains a prosecution built on the testimony of a single witness whose account the Supreme Court ultimately found unreliable on material points. It contains 15 years of imprisonment for men who were eventually acquitted. It contains a grieving father who spent 3 decades in public demanding accountability and died without receiving it in any form that a court was willing to call definitive. And it contains, in the formal legal record of the Republic of the Philippines, an open homicide case, 3 victims, no conviction, no named perpetrator, no resolution. The Vizconde Massacre is not a story about what Philippine justice got wrong in one specific case. It is a story about what happens when a justice system operating at the edge of its institutional capacity is asked to resolve a case carrying more social and political weight than any single set of institutions was designed to bear. What it produced was not justice. What it produced was a 30-year demonstration of what justice looks like when it is demanded by people who cannot afford for it to fail, and fails anyway. Lauro Vizconde's 30-year public campaign for justice in the murder of his family became, over time, something that transcended the specific legal proceedings it was nominally about and became a mirror that Philippine society held up to itself and found difficult to look at directly. He was not articulate in the trained, polished way of lawyers and politicians. He was articulate in the raw, unmediated way of a man whose grief had never had the opportunity to settle into the quieter forms that grief eventually takes when it is given resolution. He kept showing up because the alternative to showing up was accepting that the murder of his wife and daughters was the kind of thing that the system was capable of absorbing without producing an answer, and that acceptance was not something he was able to arrive at. In doing so, he made the case impossible to forget. He made it impossible for any government, any court, any institution that cared about its public legitimacy to simply allow the Vizconde Massacre to reseed into the unresolved file where inconvenient cases go to stop being anyone's professional concern. Whether his presence changed any outcome is genuinely unknowable. What is knowable is that without it, the case would have been easier to close quietly. And Lauro Vizconde did not allow anything about this to be quiet or easy for anyone involved, for 30 years, until he could no longer stand. The Vizconde Massacre is 30 years old and it is not finished. Not in the legal sense, because the case remains officially open and technically unsolved. Not in the cultural sense, because the arguments it generated about justice, class, political influence, and the reliability of witness testimony in high-pressure prosecutions are arguments that Philippine society is still having in different forms every time a high-profile case moves through the courts. And not in the human sense, because 3 women were murdered and nobody has been held accountable for their deaths, and that fact does not age or resolve or become less true with the passage of time. If this case stayed with you, if you found yourself forming opinions about the investigation, about the testimony, about the verdict and the acquittal and what both of them mean for a justice system asked to carry more than its institutional design allows, then put those opinions in the comment section below, because this is the kind of case where the conversation is still genuinely open and the public argument is still genuinely unresolved, and your perspective is part of how that argument continues. Subscribe to the Filipino Narrative for more stories like this one, the cases, the histories, the questions that the textbooks left out and that the country has never stopped needing to ask. 3 names. 30 years. No conviction. The case is still open. Watch next. The lost gold still buried in the Philippines. Subscribe to the Filipino Narrative, the stories that demand to be told.